just like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. You want me to?
Okay, while we're waiting, just want to get a sense of who's in the room. Raise your hand if you're from Colorado. Oh, that's a pretty good contingency. Hi, Coloradans, welcome. Who is from? Another Western. Yeah, shout out the state you're from. You're not from Colorado. Arizona. All right. Nebraska. North Carolina. Vermont. Maine, Montana. Wyoming, Georgia. I'm a Georgia girl, so all of Pennsylvania.
Penn State grad.
Ooh. What else? Grandma? West Virginia. Okay, West Virginia's here.
Brazil.
Brazil. All right, I think we went furthest away. Awesome. Welcome everyone. Who raise your hand if you're from DOT? Okay. Raise your hand if you're from a wildlife agency. Okay. Any feds? No feds. Okay. Nonprofit? Okay. Two nonprofits? Tribes? Just you? Okay. Just Aran. Representing here. What else did I miss? Consulting? Yeah, any consulting firms? Okay, yeah, I see a few of us. Cool. Well, welcome.
Good.
Right at 1:30. Good idea, Sean.
Yeah, I asked for that. I just get an idea of where people are from because we only have like 10 minutes up here to really introduce our projects. And it's going to be tough to really get into some details. For example, where the heck are these things in our state, right? I think somebody who Google's at Boston, don't be afraid to ask questions at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who are coming in, I have stickers. I passed them out earlier, but if you want a sticker and you didn't get one, you can get one at the end, but feel free to come up and get one. For the Alliance, should we get started? Are we good? Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to do intros first. Pat's going to go last because he's going to present first. So you know who we are, and then we're going to hear a little bit about Colorado, what we did for the prioritizing projects, and then we're going to talk about two projects specifically and how we got those funded. And we're on the snow trip tomorrow, so we're going to be getting into that as well. I'm going to start at the end. I guess I'll go real quick. Melissa Bade, nice to see you all. I work for a consulting firm called CDR Associates. We facilitate the Colorado Wildlife Transportation Alliance. We've been working with this group since 2017 and have done a lot. We were talking over lunch. This is going to really focus on our prioritization process. But there's a lot of other things that the Alliance has done. Happy to talk more about that after the session too. And all of these lovely gentlemen have been a really critical part of that alliance and how we made it work here in Colorado. So Tony, I will.
My name is Tony Cady, and I'm a planning and environmental manager for the DOT, Colorado DOT, Southwest Colorado, Region 5. I'm also one of the chairs of the Alliance and was at the beginning of the Alliance, which is kind of like my third family. My CDOT family, and my Alliance family spent a lot of time together talking about connectivity and wildlife conservation issues. If you haven't been to our website, please go check it out. If you have any questions for Alliance members, just let us know.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aran Johnson. I'm Division Head for the Southern UTV Tribe's Wildlife Resource Management Division. I've been with the tribe almost 23 years now. Most of that as wildlife biologists. I have the pleasure of collecting a lot of nuclear health movement data that I'll talk about that helps with wildlife process. Welcome.
Hi, Chuck Attardo, I work for CDOT as well. Also involved with the Colorado Wildlife Conservation Alliance, co-chair. And my projects are more sort of in the Denver metro area. This is kind of my home turf of this area.
Hello, I'm Basting, and I'm a senior biologist with Jacob, and I will start to show off
And
So Jacobs and Eco Resolutions did the wildlife prioritization studies, two separate wildlife prioritization studies that encompass the whole state. The Western Slope study was finished in 2019, and the Eastern Slope and Plains was finished in 2022. Once that was done, we had a statewide wildlife prioritization done for the entire state of Colorado. And so with that, some of the impetus behind this is people like Tony came to us and said, look, you know, in order to justify getting and moving projects forward, we need to have a rigorous study done that science-based, and we can then integrate it and use it into our transportation planning. So ultimately, the west and east slope studies, the goals were to analyze wildlife vehicle collision hotspots and wildlife movement patterns across Colorado. Both is a collaboration with CDOT and CPW. Both agencies were concerned about safety for the traveling public, as well as wildlife management and maintaining population health for Colorado's large ungulate herds. Ultimately, the long-term goal is to improve motorist safety and reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. So some of the objectives for these studies were to identify wildlife highway conflict areas under current and future traffic volumes and scenarios. Future scenarios were modeled based on a 25-year planning horizon for CDOT's long-term transportation planning. Also identify where and how mitigation will have the greatest impact on reducing wildlife highway conflict, and then support integrating wildlife mitigation into the transportation planning process as well as project development. So prioritization studies inputs focus on wildlife habitat and connectivity criteria, as well as traffic and safety criteria. For the west slope and eastern slope, we're mainly looking at mule deer and elk. Those were the primary species that were involved in the wildlife vehicle collisions the most. And so the wildlife criteria for those areas included wildlife vehicle collision risk models, magnitude of migration movement, magnitude of winter range use, wildlife vehicle collision mortality impacts on population. And for the eastern slope, we did look at bighorn sheep habitat and wildlife vehicle collision mortality areas. And that was driven mainly by data provided by CPW game wardens and biologists along the eastern slope. And then one of the other things that we did include was if there were other rigorous scientific studies that were done. And at the time, there was a study in 2017 done by Vegas et al. That looked at probability of lynx highway crossings in Colorado. And so we integrated that as a potential criteria to evaluate as well. For safety criterion, statewide, the wildlife vehicle collision pattern recognition by road type was done by CDOT's traffic and safety units. And this was a statistically rigorous pattern recognition program that they looked at the road type, whether it's 2-lane, 4-lane, divided 4-lane, and rolling terrain, flat terrain, all kinds of different things. And what they were looking at is each of those road types and their traffic volumes, they have an expected number of wildlife vehicle collisions that could potentially occur. So they know what their norm was, but when those areas, certain areas rose above those norms, then they became a pattern recognition type. So ultimately, we integrated the wildlife and the safety criteria, scored the highway segments for the entire state, and then did our final report with maps and priority segments along with decision support tools. The priority segments were identified as the top 5%, those highway segments that scored from 95 to 100% as the highest priority areas in need of being dealt with first. Not necessarily in a chronological order, it's just those are the top 5% that we're going to start working with. The decision support toolbox includes potential mitigation recommendations for those top 5% for each region in the state. The mitigation recommendations included new wildlife crossing structures or retrofit of existing structures, or alternative mitigation recommendations. It could be changing right-of-way fence, signage, potentially animal detection systems, things like that. We also developed the implementation considerations matrix, which gave decision makers a suite of other things to look at as they're looking at their top priority areas. They may have some areas where they already have partnerships, funding, land protection in place, where it makes sense to work with those areas first and move forward. So we had this consideration matrix that was developed. And then we also developed a comprehensive benefit cost analysis tool for wildlife mitigation projects. And I presented on this in 2019, I think it was, at ICOET. And the benefit cost tool calculates the benefit cost ratio for your mitigation projects. And it does it for both state and federal types of funding sources. So it's two different methodologies. And then of course the guidance for integration into wildlife highway segments, priority segments into the transportation planning and project development. So that's all in our reports, along with the maps and the decision support tools and the detailed data. So the outcomes map for the entire state, we had about 481 miles, slightly above 481 miles of priority segments identified across the state. And these guys will be talking a little bit here. The different regions, CDOT has 5 regions in the state. Region 1 is right up in here in the Denver metro area. 2 is southeast Colorado. 3 is the northwest. 4 is the northeast, and region 5, Oconee, Oregon, down here in southwest Colorado. And that's it, and I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to talk about the Wildlife and Transportation Alliance.
Perfect, thanks, Pat. We will have plenty of time for questions. I know Pat just skimmed the surface of what they did with the prioritization studies. There's so much that went into that. So if you have questions, please do ask them at the end. The Alliance took the, yes, that's perfect. If you can see it on your screen too. The Alliance took those prioritization studies and really utilized that to help us determine where do we focus our energy in Colorado. Of course, every region has their priorities and every region is kind of moving projects forward. But the Alliance itself really wanted to look at, I guess I'll stand over here so I can be in the camera. The Alliance itself really wanted to look at how do we focus Alliance priorities. So before today's session, raise your hand if you have heard of the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance. Okay, we're getting the word out there. That's pretty good. I'll take it. So what is the Alliance? So the Alliance is a partnership between CDOT, CPW, federal, tribal, academic, nonprofit, biologists, and engineering partners. So you can see a list of our partners over here. We're constantly adding partners, so it's possible this may be slightly out of date, though I think it's pretty close. We are always, whether it's adding, in recent years, the nonprofit partners have really stepped up to help us advocate at a legislative level for wildlife and transportation issues across Colorado. And of course, the DOT and Colorado Parks and Wildlife have really important roles in the Alliance, being on the chair team and working with partners like the tribe. So it really is kind of a collective effort amongst all of the partners. The mission of the Alliance was established back in 2018 to provide safe passages for people and wildlife in Colorado. Pretty simple, but as we all know, the kind of implementation of that mission is really challenging. And the vision is building a collaborative effort to improve human safety while fully integrating wildlife movement into Colorado's transportation system. Here is our website. I've got some QR codes at the end of the presentations that will show as folks, as we're doing the Q&A. You can always go to the website to learn more. We can. Okay. No, it's okay. We're just having trouble with our Zoom capabilities. Let's see. Yeah, of course. Okay. Having a hybrid meeting is very challenging. So shout out to this team who has really been, making sure everything's working together. So I really appreciate you guys. Okay. So what did we do? So the Alliance started in 2017 with the Wildlife and Transportation Summit. This was kind of a continuation of some conversations that have been happening within the Department of Transportation and Parks and Wildlife. And it stemmed from, some of you may have heard a lightning talk earlier today from Michelle Gordon, who talked a little bit about the mildew study that our Parks and Wildlife Department did. That really kind of catalyzed a lot of these conversations. Then, as you heard from Pat, there was a Western Slope Wildlife Prioritization study and an Eastern Slope study completed in 2019 and in 2022, respectively, that really gave us a sense of where the priorities across the state. There's also been a lot of political momentum, both here in Colorado and nationally. So we had a couple of secretarial orders. We had the executive order in 2019, which I think Dan Gibbs talked about yesterday morning. We had an MOU between the agencies that was signed. And then most recently, Senate Bill 151 was passed, which created a fund to help fund wildlife crossings here in the state, and initially allocated $5 million to wildlife mitigation systems. We updated the Alliance's strategic plan as a result of all of this kind of political momentum and political change in 2022. The shift there was really the Alliance at the beginning was very much kind of programmatic about building awareness and sharing information across agencies, building those relationships. And in 2022, we really shifted to focusing on projects. And that's what this presentation is kind of leading towards, is how we use that focus on projects, that new strategic guidance, to have some wins for the Alliance. And then you can see some of the other stuff. Obviously, we're here in Colorado now in 2025. We're really excited to have folks here for ICOET. Okay, this is not. Nope. Sorry, it's okay. She's struggling. This is not an easy task. Think about it. Come on. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I don't know what happened, but it went. Okay, so what we did as an Alliance, we said, okay, we're going to focus on projects. We want to get projects funded. But we know with the 400 plus miles, we can't do all of that at once. So how do we prioritize and really start to think about and focus on specific areas? We knew that we wanted every region to be represented. We knew that we wanted them to be important projects, to have kind of existing momentum, to have local support. And so we thought about, okay, what are the questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to establish what these projects are going to be? So that's kind of the why, the what, the how do we bring in regions, what has changed, what changes on an annual basis, and then what input is the Alliance seeking from our partners. So why do we prioritize projects? So we best leverage the state and federal resources to implement as many wildlife crossings and wildlife supporting infrastructure projects as possible. We also prioritize projects in order to advance the Alliance's mission. And as I mentioned, these strategic plan initiatives to move those forward. So you can see here, strengthening our collaborative forum, advancing the Slope and West Slope priorities, establishing funding, and then coordinating planning efforts. Here in my hand, I'm holding this one pager here on, I guess it's your left that you're looking at. And this one pager really kind of outlines, and I printed a few copies for folks at the end. If you want to grab a copy, I also have a QR code. But it really outlines kind of what is the process that we go to determine these priorities, who are the decision makers, how do we make those decisions. Here on your right is a little bit about the matrix that we developed. So using the information that we collected from our prioritization studies, we developed a matrix with really specific targeted questions that came from the studies, but also that we knew were important as an alliance in order to identify what priorities we wanted as a region and then as a state. So what did it look like? So we developed those criteria, we engaged regions, we asked each region, so each of those 5 regions in Colorado, to identify 5 projects. What are the top 5 projects that you want to do, right? So maybe that's a little bit bite-sized, that they can kind of handle identifying the 5 projects. We identified possible priorities, and then we looked at the matrix. We looked at those criteria with those 5 projects and helped us narrow down to 1 project per region. Felt like, yeah, that 5-6 projects is really doable. And then we wanted to ensure that every region was represented in that. And then we also heard from external stakeholders who weren't necessarily part of the alliance, maybe just had specific projects that are happening locally or specific issues that were happening locally. We heard from them, hey, how do I get to be an alliance priority? How do I get to be focused on? And so we thought about, what is that process? What does that look like? It largely runs through the DOT, right? So whether it's on the 10-year plan or the transportation improvement plan, there's a few different plans that our DOT really relies on to get projects across the finish line. And so we really encourage those local groups to connect with their DOT representatives, to have those conversations, to start elevating those different projects. And then we also recognize that there are many projects, as Pat mentioned, 400 miles worth of worthy local efforts across Colorado, but not all of them are considered priorities during a specific cycle. Our cycle usually lasts a year. We really try to get projects funded. If they are funded, then we kind of hope to fill that gap. So here's what we came up with initially. This was in 2022. We had a project per region. We actually had 2 projects for Region 3, in part because for those of you who are going on the field trip tomorrow, you'll see I-70 Eastvale Pass is a really visible project. So that brings a lot of education, a lot of information, a lot of momentum, and there's some support at higher levels for that project as well. But we also knew for Region 3 that US 40 project was a priority. Great news is we got 2 fully funded projects in that cycle. So I-25 Greenland Overpass, if any of you are going on that field trip tomorrow, you'll hear about that from Chuck, was fully funded through the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program. And then Elmore's Corner, US 160, this was an infra grant, is that right, Tony? So got funded through an infra grant. So then we backfilled, wanted to keep the projects in those regions. Now here are the list of 6 projects that the Alliance has prioritized. If you want more information about these projects, you can stop by the CDOT table, or the CDR table has one-pagers on each of these projects that go into greater detail. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Tony to talk a little bit about the 160 project that was really an early win for this effort. Oh, you should have the mic. You're going to talk in that one? Okay. While we're changing, I'll just mention we have stickers up here with the one pager too. So if you guys want to stop by on your way out, feel free to get a sticker. Okay.
There we
All right, so again, I'm Tony, Cady. I work with the Colorado Department of Transportation. And Aran and I are really going to focus our conversation on a project that was recently completed in 2022 on the US 160 corridor in Southwest Colorado. And we're going to bring two different perspectives. I work for the DOT, Aran works with the tribe. We had a very strong partnership in this particular project, and we have very different ways of thinking about how it came together and how successful it was. I like this picture as my first slide when I talk about this project, because the last picture is also of this exact same spot, but in real life. So you can see the difference between how cool the rendering is and how beautiful that you think it's going to be and what the reality of our projects can actually be. All right, so again, this is in Southwest Colorado, and this was one of the most successful collaborative efforts that I've been involved with at my tenure at the DOT. And we thought it'd be a good example of kind of how Colorado goes about using prioritization processes. We have multiple, to build partnerships and to develop funding to deliver these types of projects. This project is centered around a US highway and a state highway. Both gets lots of traffic. But it falls primarily within Southern Ute tribal lands, which is a unique situation in Colorado, and it's limited to the southern part of the state. So we work with our tribal partners quite a bit on planning and then delivering projects. All right, so this stretch of highway has been a well-known hotspot for wildlife vehicle collisions forever, for as long as I can remember. I mean, we always had lots of supporting documentation saying that this should be a priority for the department. I think Melissa mentioned the West Slope Mule Deer strategy, which was really focused on getting the DOT and CPW working together to address these kind of hotspot areas, looking at population declines. We had the State Wildlife Action Plan, directing the agencies to work together to prioritize projects that would improve wildlife habitat across the state. And then most importantly was that West Slope Wildlife Prioritization study that was published in 2019, which really provided the DOT with direction on how we should spend our limited transportation dollars. In this particular case, we had invaluable additional information from Aran and the Southern Ute tribe that really helped us identify this being a priority and one that we really should fund almost immediately. It was a planned multifaceted safety improvement project, so much more than just wildlife mitigation. But it's right next to Lake Capote, which is a Sioux-owned, Southern Ute Indian tribe-owned recreational area. It's right next to Chimney Rock National Monument. And it's on the US 160 corridor, which is the kind of highway in southern Colorado. It's the route you would take to get anywhere in the southern part of the state. So lots of traffic and a tremendously high accident rate. All right, so really the conversation is around how to use a prioritization model to select priorities when a lot of your priorities basically are the same, right? You've got a lot of really, really bad locations that need to be mitigated. How do you drive to a decision on selecting the first one? And that West Slope Wildlife Prioritization study really was kind of the directing force for a lot of how the department looked at our priorities. It narrowed down the top 5% worst of the worst highway segments in the state. So we had a really good start. We knew where all the really, really bad spots were. Unfortunately, in southwest Colorado, my area, it left me with 24 different spots that really needed to be mitigated pretty much right now. So how could I figure out where the best use of our limited safety dollars would go to? And that was through identifying other data sources which could help us make those decisions. As you can see, this was the 4th highest score of all of our 24 highway segments. So it wasn't the top, but it was the first one that was built after the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization study was published. And that was due to using external influencing factors. The study recognized that we would need to do this, so it included these secondary implementation considerations, matrices, and we use those to refine our project selection process. You use the matrix, you go through, you answer the questions. If you've got a yes, it's a positive. If you've got a no, it's a negative. Really, you add them all up and you see which ones are the most important, and it really helps you pick the project that should be implemented first. And so we utilize that process with this particular project. This is the Wildlife and Transportation Alliance implementation considerations. And this, our project predates this matrix, but our project also helps set the baseline for kind of those primary considerations that you should be considering when you're trying to pick between one project and another that have pretty much the same kind of biological and safety rating on the prioritization studies. And I know you can't read any of this, so I'm going to talk about what these kind of influencing factors were. But we had some incredible data from the Southern Ute Indian tribe, which really allowed us to see that if we treated this relatively short highway segment, 3, 4, 5 miles long, we would have a huge impact on habitat connectivity for two of the most important herds in Colorado, mule deer herd and a elk herd. We had a safety improvement project planned at this exact same location, which would allow us to have a touch it once mentality philosophy, which the DOT doesn't do the best at, but we always try to achieve. We don't like to do a project on year 1 and then go back and do another project on year 5. It's bad optics and it's a waste of money. So looking at the site security, it's got Forest Service to the north and Southern Ute Indian tribal lands to the south. So incredible site security and one of the best locations that we knew we could site a mitigation project and not have to worry about additional acquisitions of conservation easements or purchasing property. Huge potential for partnering. So as anyone who works for the DOT knows, you know, funding drives priorities and priorities drive funding. And it depends on which scenario you're in, which one is the most influencing factor. In this particular one, we had a partner who was willing to come to the table with funding, which really drove this as a priority for the state. And then political and local support. We had a ton of local support. We were also working with a sovereign nation who was using their political influence to tell the DOT that we really should be focusing on this highway segment that was really impacting tribal members. And that helps someone in my position, it helps define what those priorities are and to push that up the chain to hopefully get funding towards a project. Pat didn't mention this, but I did want to mention really quick, our prioritization studies also provided preliminary mitigation recommendations at each highway segment, so both for the east and west slope. So a ton of work, a ton of ground truthing to look at viable mitigation options. And that really allowed us to look at this particular site, look at some potential options, and look to see what the potential cost could be, which is always important when you're weighing costs versus benefits. And speaking of the benefit, you know, the DOT were really focused on accidents. We knew that over 60% of the accidents on this segment of road were wildlife vehicle collisions, and it is one of the most heavily used corridors in southern Colorado. We also knew that we could achieve an 85 to 90% reduction in accidents by implementing a solid mitigation system, which provides the benefit. So here's the partners. Aran had been approaching the DOT for over a decade, asking us to do a project, and he continually asked us, talked about the safety issues, talked about the data behind it, and that's often what it takes is 10 years of pestering a DOT to work hard to find the money, and 10 years of pestering to make it a priority. Unfortunately, that is the situation that we're in and usually are in because we have so many competing interests. But the DOT recognizes how partners really promote and prioritize projects, and we had lots of partners on this particular effort. And without those partners, this project wouldn't have been a success. When we applied for our faster safety funding source, which helps us build our safety enhancement projects, We were only approved for enough to conduct the mainline safety improvements and then potentially 2 wildlife underpasses on this corridor and associated fencing and jump outs and all those things. But given the extreme importance of this linkage to the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, they actually approached us with a funding partnership proposal that would ensure that the second crossing structure would be an overpass to improve the usefulness of that crossing structure for elk. We're still short of funding. These are very expensive projects, and CPW approached the DOT with $750,000 to help us kind of get across the finish line. We were still a little short, so I applied for a bunch of grants and was able to get $500,000 in grants from other funders. It was a little under $12 million, and you can see who provided what for the project. And we did a lot with that. We were able to build a wildlife underpass to the west of the 151 intersection at a highly concentrated crossing point, the overpass to the east of the intersection at a conflict area crossing point, deer fencing throughout the corridor, jump outs, deer guards, all of the things that are attached to a system of this kind, vegetation management, and then those mainline safety improvements that I mentioned that were causing the other 40% of the accidents on this segment. This is a picture of what the wildlife underpass looks like, and we were able to pinpoint where this needed to go, working with tribal staff and starting with those preliminary recommendations that Pat and crew came up with. And it's really important that you have adequate data to help you locate these structures, and that was never more apparent than this particular circumstance when we did have a winter shutdown on this particular project. And deer and elk were using it immediately after it opened up, and we even had construction equipment moving up on the road top up above it. So highly successful underpass structure. This is a picture of what the wildlife overpass looks like with Chimney Rock National Monument in the background. This is just another glory shot because it's so pretty. And then this is just a shout out to those partners. We've got lots of engagement and enthusiasm from the governor's office. The person with the scissors is the first gentleman. So he was there for the ribbon cutting. We had tribal council there, and then all the other funding partners. So Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Mule Deer Foundation, and NIFWIF. So a great collaborative effort. And I'm gonna turn it over to the tall guy there in the back. On the left-hand side, Aran, who's going to talk about this project from the tribal perspective.
Boy, am I going to work out this PowerPoint. Working on Zoom. And as Tony said, so I'm going to talk about this from the tribe's perspective, show you a little bit about the data that's collected to contribute to citing the project, and some results on how the project is working. So am I just using, can I use this? Okay. All right, well, I was, looks like formatting might be an issue here, but glad to see that there's a lot of people from out of state. There's some from out of country, just for giving you orientation. So obviously this is a generalized map of Colorado, and we're up here in Denver at the Star. Southern Ute tribal lands are down near the Four Corners region in the southwest part of the state. Today, the Southern Ute Indian Reservation encompasses 2,600 square kilometers in southwestern Colorado. And regardless of the establishment of the reservation, all of Colorado and portions of the bordering states are all considered Ute country. For decades, tribal wildlife resource managers have focused on identifying mule deer and elk seasonal migration and identifying obstacles to these movements in the interest of keeping landscapes connected. Southern Ute Reservation lies in the foothills of the San Juan Mountains. Tribal lands range from about 1,800 meters to 2,700 meters in elevation, which is really low country compared to the high San Juans, which have peaks up to 4,200 meters tall. 14ers, lots of them down in that country. The reservation contains much of the last best winter range habitat for mule deer and elk in the San Juan Mountains. Understanding the ecology of how these animals move is critical to ensuring they persist on tribal lands and continue to return to the Southern Ute people. Federal public lands north of the reservation act as effective summer range or transitional habitat. Referencing the slide, so you can see the federal public lands, Forest Service lands in green, BLM in yellow, tribal lands are in orange, and fee or private lands are not shaded in. And behind that arrow, you can see, as Tony already referenced, the Forest Service land, so that federal land is coming right up against tribal land, which is a really good situation for landscape connectivity. If you look on the west side of the reservation, so a little bit west of Durango, you can see that corridor, how it's really all private lands. There's a lot of development pressure in there. And kind of more recent collaring studies suggest that a lot of that migration, that connection is being severed over there because of that. So highlighted in yellow is the US Highway 160 corridor running east. Oh, let's see. Guess it didn't show up in yellow. Anyway, you can see the Highway 160 corridor running across there. Our migrations for mule deer and elk are north-south. Wow, formatting really got messed up. Traditionally, the Ute people knew all there was to know about animal movement as it related to their lives. They moved seasonally with wildlife, including the mule deer and the elk. While that info was passed down through families, the modern era of wildlife management meant that speaking the Western science language with neighboring agencies was necessary to communicate tribal knowledge and needs. Tribal-led VHF radio collar studies in the 1980s and 90s showed general movement and seasonal range patterns. Obviously, those just provide a couple of data points a year. But moving into the 2000s, from 2003 through the present, the tribe has been collecting detailed movement data on mule deer and elk. These data sets and the knowledge on animal movement ensures a seat at the table when the tribe talks about wildlife management in the San Juans with neighboring agencies. These data sets also become a critical communication tool with other agencies and researchers. For example, the image shows general mule deer movement patterns collected by the tribe and later work by researchers in New Mexico substantially added to the breadth of understanding of how mule deer were moving across a multi-jurisdictional landscape. And I'll also say our partnership with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we've added, these movement maps of mule deer and elk through this region are really, really substantial. I'm going to now focus more in on the project site here. In particular, it's a small parcel of tribal land at the intersection of Colorado State Highway 151 and US Highway 160. For decades, wildlife agency staff from the tribe and the state have focused on this area because of high wildlife vehicle collision rates. And then all the years of collar data also highlighted this section of roadway as a critical migratory crossing point. Rounding bridge modeling with tribal mule deer data in the mid-2000s illustrated how migrating animals contributed to very high roadkill rates on this highway. Armed with a substantial animal movement data set and with support from the Southern Ute Tribal Council, as well as multiple tribal departments, we maintained an open dialogue with the Colorado Department of Transportation about the tribe's desire to see a wildlife crossing project on the reservation near the intersection of State Highway 151 and US Highway 160 near Lake Capote, as Tony said, in Chimney Rock National Monument. I think everybody in here is aware of the timelines. Tony talked about 10 years plus. Sometimes that can be discouraging. It's not meant to be discouraging. These things just take a really long time. Fortunately, I think for this project, there was longevity and consistency with tribal staff and CDOT staff. And collectively, we maintained communication. It wasn't all, tribal staff like going after CDOT, like what's happening. There's enough longevity there where CDOT staff is also calling us, hey, let's keep this conversation going. So it was a really good effort. As movement and migration became more popular with the public and leaders in government, possibilities of this project became more real. And then as Tony also mentioned, There were other improvements planned for this particular spot, which meant add-on wildlife vehicle collision mitigation measures might be in play for the site as well. And when, again, multiple partners came to the table committing to funding, this really snowballed into a reality. And then we could start talking about specific crossing structures. Types of wildlife crossing structures that would be built wasn't initially clear. As you're all aware, and as Tony pointed out with the dollar signs on this project, super expensive. At the outset, CDOT engineers suggested 2 underpasses to keep costs more reasonable, but research consistently shows that elk do not particularly use underpasses. We know, the state knows, the tribe knows that thousands of mule deer and elk cross this area seasonally, and if elk didn't use the underpasses, it could be a wasted effort. So the tribe pushed for what we wanted, an underpass paired with an overpass, and the project, I'll just point out again, I think Tony mentioned, the project area is pretty small. It's about 3 kilometers, it's 2 miles. We've got those 2 structures in there and the associated fencing and jump outs. Where would the structures be sited? That seemed like a relatively easy thing. If I pan through here, here's some of the tribe's mule deer movement data. This is the Lake Capote here, and put elk on top of that, and you start to see some patterns of where things are really crossing through there. And so wildlife vehicle collision data, red being the higher hit areas, and eventually said, okay, underpass to the west, overpass to the east. Radio color data showed us generally where the structures might be placed, but terrain also dictated what types of structures would be feasible. On the west end of the project, where the collar and collision data said large numbers of animals were crossing, the roadway is elevated, making it ideal for an underpass. About 1 kilometer to the east, the data showed another busy animal crossing section, and here the roadway is recessed, which made for a suitable site for an overpass. Both structures span 3 lanes of traffic. Project broke ground in spring 2021 and was completed in fall 2022, so there were 2 full seasons of construction. The structures have been open and accessible for animal use for 2 years, and so how are they working to cross animals? Following numbers reflect 1 year of monitoring, 2023-2024, and were collected by Patty Kramer and Robert Hamlin. The Wildlife Connectivity Institute is contracted by CDOT to monitor the structures and other project components using remote cameras. The good news of the project is that the project is proving exceedingly successful at keeping animals off US Highway 160 right away. As has been demonstrated across the West, mule deer are readily using this underpass. We see peaks in use during the spring and fall migration, but there's year-round use as well. From October 2023 to October 2024, the underpass saw over 1,900 mule deer success movements, meaning animals moving through the structure without repelling. This is 5 successful deer crossings per day. Mule deer had a 93% success rate crossing through the underpass. Similarly predictable, based on other sites in the West, we are not seeing much elk use of this underpass. During the 1 year monitoring period, we saw only 37 elk success movements through the underpass, which is 0.1 crossings per day, and elk only had a 77% success rate going through the underpass. Carnivores, including coyotes and foxes, made 41 success movements during the monitoring period, and we feel that these are really good numbers and have high hopes that they will increase over the next several years. If the underpass is performing well, the overpass is performing beyond expectations. The 1 year monitoring period recorded over 7,400 mule deer success movements, which is 20 successful crossings per day, and had a 98% success rate. The main push for constructing an overpass was to cross elk. Other overpass projects in the West show elk use, and so we were banking that this structure would too. And indeed, the US Highway 160 overpass is successfully crossing large numbers of elk. For the 1 year monitoring period, we saw nearly 1,000 elk success movements, which is 2.7 successful crossings per day, and had a 93% success rate crossing elk over the overpass. Elk were recorded crossing in herds exceeding 200 individuals, and all sex and age classes were represented or are represented. The overpass also saw a more diverse representation of other species using the structure compared to the underpass, in addition to the carnivores. So we saw coyotes, red foxes, gray foxes, mountain lions, and bobcats, and bears, which are very important to the Ute. We also recorded raccoons, lagomorphs, and even wild turkeys using the overpass. In conclusion, this project took a very long time to develop, but being able to report nearly 11,000 successful wildlife movements across this small section of highway in a one-year period makes it well worth the efforts of all the partners over so many years. We look forward to continued success with the project for many years to come. And I'll just say, and Patty came to me last night and said, hey, we got some more numbers on this. And I mean, the short of it would be adding another 2 months to this. There were another 1,000 mule deer success movements and another 500 elk success movements just in that next 2 months. We're seeing a lot of success here. So that's what I have. Say thank you and look forward to any questions you have, and I'll pass it off to Chuck.
All right, I'll be quick here so you guys can have some time to answer or ask some questions. Today, right now, we're in construction with the largest wildlife overpass in North America. And I see some of our California friends in the room too, so they have a big as well going on. But success, getting that thing in construction, the success we had wasn't always easy. It wasn't always comfortable. This is the short story, very short story, of how the Greenland Wildlife Overpass became a statewide priority. Again, I'll try to run through this quick. Dimensions for the wildlife overpass, we can come back to this if you guys have questions. 200 feet wide by about 204 feet long, above and above. But you can't begin to tell the story about the overpass unless I touch on the I-25 South Gap project. This project involves a 18-mile piece of I-25 where it was just 2 lanes in each direction. And happens to be a piece of I-25 that connects our 2 largest cities. So it was like the last remaining piece of interstate that was the 4-lane section. So in 2018, we started a NEPA process to address the severe safety, mobility, transportation, or travel reliability and incident management problems. We got with our stakeholders and our partners, and here are some of the things we came up with to fix it. We needed to add at least another lane in each direction. All right, we needed to add these big wide shoulders for incident management, better incident management. We need to improve the port interchanges. We needed to straighten out some curves, and we wanted to build, and we did build, a new wildlife mitigation system that consisted of 5 new wildlife crossings. But the EA also recommended a large overpass south of the Greenland area. All right, so that just for everybody in the room, that's about 40 miles due south of here. Construction, we started the EA January 2018. Construction was August 2018. 8 months to turn dirt, to go from EA to turn dirt. That's pretty quick. And we just simply did not have time to get the landowner approval on the east side. Very, very large and influential landowner. He, at the time, was the largest landowner in North America. We also didn't quite have enough funding in our construction budget for the overpass. But you heard Aran talk about elk and why they prefer overpasses, right? This is actually a shot looking from the overpass looking east on a snowy February day. I mean, there's 200 or 300 head of elk right there, right? So we knew that we needed to build this overpass. We needed to. In fact, our executive director got me and said, Chuck, this is part of the EA. You cannot let this go. Get with all your cohorts and make sure this doesn't die. Because the elk needed the overpass, even though we had an underpass
to the north and overpass to the south. Elk needed it, and we need to sort of split the difference between the two underpasses they constructed with the gap project. So we didn't let go of this idea. We were pretty bummed. That was like our first big failure. We had so much success with the gap project, and we're not able to get this overpass part of the construction package. But Douglas County, very influential county, stepped up. They said, let's try to fund preliminary design and some right-of-way mapping. Let's keep this thing going. And that actually got us enough information so that we can work with the landowner and get his approval to build part of that overpass on his property. Because he wasn't so sure about it. It also got us some information that could meet up with the conservation easement managers and get their support on the project as well. By the way, this is I-25 is in the middle of the picture, and this is sort of standing on the west side of where the overpass would be, looking east, before we started construction. So we're feeling pretty good, and in 2020, we submit a build grant asking for design and construction funds. A couple months later, we get the sorry email. I bet a lot of people in this room have gotten the sorry email. Yeah, you got a great project, but sorry, didn't make the list this time. And we were so upset. And looking back on that, you know, I remember being upset, going to the gym, just trying to work it out, you know. And just looking at the application the next day and saying, there was too many questions, unanswered questions. And I totally understand why they didn't fund that build grant. So what do? You had to dig deep on your courage, right? And Tony, what's the word you use? Pester? Yeah, Tony used the word pester. But we had to align ourselves with people who had the same belief as us, that really believe in this overpass. And I really look to two people really, and one organization that really helped us in this thing. First, our regional director. She stepped up to the plate. And she said, Chuck, you don't have final design yet. Let's get final design so you can get some of those questions answered. So the USDOT can say that when answer questions, right? So she funded final designs. We get busy going final design. By the way, we did all the design in-house. No consulting help, because this was such a high priority project for us. The second person that really kind of stepped up to the plate was our safety and traffic engineer. You heard Tony talk about a funding source called FASTER. Our traffic and safety engineer gave us like 3 years worth of FASTER safety funding, 7.5 million, to use as our grant match for construction. And I said, well, man, Tony, I can't do that to you. His name's Tony Breezy. And he's like, no, Chuck, we really believe in your project. I said, fantastic. And then third was the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance. Melissa, Tony, Aran, others, Pat. We worked with them to get this project as one of the statewide priorities, one of the 7 priorities for the state. Not only that, we were able to get some money out of the alliance to use as overmatch on our grants, our next grant application. And so in 2023, August 2023, we're feeling pretty damn good. And we have our final design in place. We have our grant and grant overmatch in place, and we have all the support and approvals from the landowners and the alliance, right? And we submit for the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program in August 2023, and in December of 2023, we're notified that we got all 22 million for the wildlife overpass that we requested, and all those failures and all that frustration, you know, turns into immediate joy, right? And I'll just leave you with this. I mean, we've learned lessons on all these big projects, right? But despite all the failures, and we talked about a couple, we didn't win the build grant, right? We didn't get this thing in the original construction package, right? And there's lots of other small ones. But despite all the failures, if you are able to align yourself with the right people, people who really believe in what you're doing, you can get anything accomplished. So keep moving forward. Let's stop there and go to questions.
Okay, so we got all of our panelists up there. You want to sit, you want to stand, have a range. Go ahead and sit.
It's pretty hot over there.
Yeah, it is really, it's warm.
We're getting blown by that fan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you can have the hot seat again.
Thank you all for sitting, it's a little warm in this room, just in general. Thank you all for sitting through it. So, yes, we've got the opportunity to pose questions here on the screen. I also have a couple of QR codes before we leave that I'll pull up at the very end. Just for one pager, Alliance resources, we've got the East Local, West Local studies on the Alliance website. The Alliance website, we're trying to kind of make it a really great go-to resource. So each of the one pagers for all of our priority projects are up there. And trying to get all that information up there, just contact form if you have more questions for the Alliance. So speaking of questions, for our panelists today, who has a question? Yeah, great. Hands up. Tell us where you're from first.
Hi everyone, I'm Greg, I'm from Maine, representing the State Wildlife Agency. And we are we've been behind the ball on wildlife crossings, special wildlife crossings anyway. And we're just starting the prioritization process. So how do you recommend we start to tackle this massive undertaking? We have some ideas, but you've learned the lessons, so where do we begin?
Great question. That's something I'll give you first.
I'm just gonna tell them to call back.
Call Pat. I think Tony's
I was
advocating.
thinking the same thing. Yeah.
Pat, you want to answer?
That's a loaded question. Really, it started with the collaboration and reaching out, the implementation and DOT folks working together, getting on the same page, identifying yes, we have a need, we have a common objective. And then from there, we really did work hard with the DOT staff and Parks and Wildlife staff to identify the different criteria that I had up there for the different regions and the different species. And then go through the weighting process. You have to, for each of your highway segments, we broke them down to half-mile segments for the entire state. And then did some merging after. And once we did that, then you have both your biological data and your safety data. You're meeting the objectives and criteria that you're setting out to do. And then from there, you can get your scoring, identify your priority areas. And then really working with the DOT to find out and learn about the transportation planning process and the project development process. And how they work, what their timelines are, what the different plans are, and how to start getting this stuff integrated early. So that you're not trying to get funding after the project has already been developed and you're trying to go back. And that is what we studied in 2021 from that full study talked about states and how they integrate these things into the transportation plan.
Pat, can I say something too?
Yes.
What's your name back there?
Right.
Greg. Yeah. Hey, Chuck. So I think there's two levels. I think Tony and I were thinking immediately, talk to Pat. That's the first level. From a science perspective, you got to figure out what's a priority in your state, right? But then I think what Pat was also touching on there is there's also a kind of a step after that. So you have these high priority areas from a science perspective. What really is ready? What has political backing? What has funding? There's almost a second step to prioritize them. And you need some sort of group to do that. That's why the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance is so important to Colorado. That's our job, is to prioritize these high priority segments that Pat and Julia came up with. Yeah. Tony, did you want to touch on that too?
Yeah, I wanted to just mention, I've heard about 3 different prioritization models today. So we've got ours, I think this is the best one. No, but the Rangers in California, and we had a great presentation the other day with thoughts, prioritization model. So being a little behind is not that bad because you've got great examples. from. And I think figuring out what data your state actually has right now is a great place to start, and how you can use GIS to overlay those layers and then suss out gaps in the data, and then how you're gonna go about filling those gaps, and then figuring out how to prioritize those segments for your. One of the great things that I think Colorado was able to do was we took the priorities, at least in my area, we took the priorities identified by that study, the Western Wildlife Prioritization study, and we brought those past projects into our planning process. So transportation planning is kind of this black box, but when you work with your stakeholder groups, they're throwing out projects, right? I need something here, I need something there. You got a limited pool of funding, so we start prioritizing. We were able to use our priority segments in our safety pool of competing projects. And in rural Colorado, that's a critical safety issue. So we were able to fund a lot of projects that we normally wouldn't have been able to do by incorporating those as projects in our plan. She mentioned our 10-year plan. We have 25-year long-range transportation plan. We've got 4-year strategic transportation improvement plan. That's stuff we're actually working on right now. 25 years is all things we want to work on. We split the gap and we have a 10-year strategic plan. We have 25 projects on our strategic plan across the structures. And all of those are somehow related to us. So those priorities made it into our planning process, which then gets them funded. And I think that the critical thing is having a State Highway 9 type project, kind of a glamorous project that everyone loves, it's incredibly successful. Having that success really kind of breeds more success, right? People learn about it, they know about it, they want to be involved with something like that. And one of the biggest things we're promoting is what's the public education, why it's necessary, why it's important, and getting people excited about it. I think that helps that prioritization as well, right? You get political parties talking about their pet projects, and that builds priority, right? The legislature telling you that he wants that project at first, probably.
And I'll just add, don't overlook the tribes, state or federal agencies. When you're embarking on these projects, there should be government-to-government consultation between the state and tribes that might be involved in it. Penobscot, you've got, there's Indian country all over, and a lot of times the habitats that are there are supporting these big migrations. But consulting with the tribes early and often establishing relationships before you're there to ask them for something is really, really important. We're really, fortunate in Southwest Colorado, the Southern Ute Mountain Ute tribe, has these established relationships with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Colorado Department of Transportation. But I would just say, don't overlook the tribes. There's good opportunity there as well.
Okay, I got a couple more. I have a ton of here, and then we'll come back. Oh, sorry, Aaron. Stepping on people's stuff.
Well, my question is to right on target with what you just said. So I had the privilege of working in Connecticut and several other jurisdictions. Was there any thought in the overpass and underpass project, or did you incorporate tribal art in the facade or finishing of the overpass?
You want to go first?
We did not. We context sensitive solution. We have a corridor continuity plan, and so the design of that one very closely matches other interchange overpasses that were built closer to where I live in the Panelists and Durango. So if you drive through our corridor from New Mexico into Durango and down to Pacosa, all of the structures look the same. And there's an expectation, driver expectation of what all the structures are. So we didn't probably had more conversations about that.
Well, to be fair to it, it is CDOT structure. It's within the CDOT right of way. However, I will say, I think Tony had a picture of kind of the opening ceremony there, and the tribe was heavily involved, tribal council, Sundance chief, blessing that structure in an appropriate way to open it up. And so the tribe was really involved in that as well. So that was important for opening that stretch.
Real quick, for the overpass, Greenland overpass, we had a corridor aesthetic plan similar to what Tony's talking about. And that was one of the stipulations of the landowner approval, was to adhere to that. Because we were talking to insurance companies and they were interested in helping us fund it, but they wanted their name somewhere, and that was a killer. Couldn't do it. Yeah. So we stuck to our corridor aesthetics plan.
Okay, and just for folks in the room, I have scored many actual environmental actions across the, and you can incorporate tribal art in any infrastructure item you see to do with respect to constitution of the tribe. And it'd be beautiful. So that's why I was asking the question.
One of the other things that has been done elsewhere as well is having a place line structure that integrates both tribal language for what they call the area as well as the English.
Great. Okay, one more question here.
Hey there, Deb, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, former Montana Department of Transportation. And my question is, I mean, we've had a partnership in place for nearly 10 years between MDT, our Department of Transportation, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and then a coalition of NGOs, Montana's for Safe Wildlife Passage. I'm curious about the culture of the agencies, and in particular, the DOT, and has it always been, we're into this, we're doing this, you know, this is a priority, we're gonna incorporate this into our plan, like, how did that come to be, or was it always there? Because we struggle with that, and these are extra, they're taking away resources from what the highway needs actually are. I mean, that's just the culture that exists, and we've been working to make inroads on that for a long, long time. That's my first question. My second question is, clearly, federal grants play a significant part of the funding scheme, and in the current landscape, I'm kind of wondering what Plan B might be. Like, well, I mean, what's next, right? Yeah, thanks.
Tony will start.
Sure. Culture, it's changed so much since we started. I remember being in Ridgeway at 550, which is another South Main corridor in Colorado. And I met with CW folks, and they didn't want us putting fence up because they didn't want us blocking movement, right? Makes sense, but it also prevents accidents and it preserves population. So that was in 2016, right? We were having conversations where, no, you're not putting up a fence. And we're talking about the need to do that from a safety standpoint. Building underpasses and meeting with the local sheriff who says, wasted $2 million. Animals don't use those things, right? And it's changed a ton. The Alliance has a huge part to play in that, right? We've got really committed members of both agencies promoting and pushing and talking about it all the time. And I think that really helps. We also have a bunch of really dumb engineers, and that has changed the game, right? They enter into an engineering training position, understanding that they have to incorporate environmental perspectives in their design and their construction. If I talk to a guy who's been there for 25 years and I want to install small mammal culvert or even something as expensive as an underpass, it's a hard conversation. And I really have to show them the data behind it, right? How it pays for itself. And even then, it's not clear. Which is why getting in the planning process is so important, because then they're not making that decision. The decision's been made and the funding side of that project, they're not choice. So that was a really critical. And then I think since 2017, we've been having these summits. We've been working with the CW hand in hand. We have co-agency trainings. And it's just really kind of changed the relationship between the two agencies where we're partners, as opposed to kind of each had our own track, right? We had our own goals and missions, and sometimes they aligned, but often they didn't. We have this small intersect where we, impact things that they're worried about, and so that's why this this group is so important, and with all the staff in the conversation. We're working on priorities together. What's the second question?
The funding.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have a governor who has elected to not comply with a lot of the directives that have come from Washington DC. So we don't have that. We are here to still keep the rules as far as federal funding.
Yeah.
And I do see some lean years coming up, and since a lot of the last transportation authorization was grant-based instead of formula-based, we're going to struggle, I think, a little bit, but we're going to still go after it. In our solution, at a smaller scale, I live in a very rural part of Colorado. We don't compete well with the metro areas, so we work with our counties. We have the counties submit our grant applications. We do everything. We prepare the grant, we administer the grant, it's their name on that grant proposal. The tribe has submitted like 6 applications for us in the past because they're mutual benefit. And so if our name is not the project proponent, we think we're going to have more success, hopefully, as opposed to being Z, it's going to not apply to ICE. Right. The other solution I think we found is we have something in Colorado called TABOR, which limits the amount of tax we can burden the citizens with. And so we're now doing a lot of fees on deliveries, fees on uses of our tunnels, fees on everything. And it's funding a lot of initiatives. That 10-year strategic plan is all funded by these fees. It's a significant source of revenue. And then it's state-only funding, and so there aren't all the hoops you have to jump through to comply with federal standards, and that will keep us moving into the future. But we're still doubling our base program over the next 10 years, and 25% of all
Can I, Deb, what is your message to MDOT on why you need to build these? How do you ask?
Well, it's really interesting because, I mean, you're talking about safety and your use of safety funding and all, but primarily, in our experience, it doesn't rise to, it wouldn't qualify for safety funding. I mean, they're not fatalities. Most of them are property damage only.
Property damage only.
You know? And so from their perspective, they understand 25% of the collisions on this corridor are wildlife related, 50% are wildlife related. But it's not at the level when we have so many rural miles of highway and people are rolling over or head on collisions, like that's where the safety money is, right? So I mean, it's just, there's a lot of differences, you know, but so there's safety and there's biology. You hear everyone, but that's why we live here in Montana. We love the wildlife. It's our quality of life. It's billions of dollars in our economy. But we're also have 500 load-posted bridges that have to be replaced in the next like 5-7 years. That's like their #1 priority. Now, does that afford some opportunity? Yes.
Maybe.
But most of those are like not on the state highways. They're county highways. There's low traffic. They're not like hotspots for wildlife, right? So it's just viewed as this like sort of competing for already committed funding for other reasons.
Hold on, Pat.
I just can't change that narrative as much as I've tried.
So here, that safety message works.
Yeah.
We did a terrible job 20 and 30 years ago because we would come to our engineers and say, there's elk and deer and bear and mountain lions getting hit. Okay, what does that mean to us? We have learned to repackage that message. Our mission at the Alliance is safe passage for wildlife and people. All right. And we can show that these wildlife mitigation systems that we're constructing pay for themselves in 20 years by reducing property damage, by reducing injuries, by reducing fatalities. And that includes the cost of our wildlife, one of our most precious resources here. Yeah. So that's our message that helps.
Yeah.
Pat, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Tony talked about it a little bit, as far as getting the, this one of the advantages of doing the statewide assessment on priority areas is that it gives you a list of where do we need to start? Rather than trying to do it project by project basis as things come along. And the big thing that has been really successful down here is that they're not only integrating it into one transportation plan and the plan step, but they're meeting with county commissions and integrating it into the regional transportation plan. And so you're getting local people that are also talking to the legislators on, we want this, this is a priority for us. And then it gets bumped in the planning process where the funding is allocated up front, and you're integrating some of the wildlife into that, rather than waiting for the project to come out as an engineering project, and you're coming back with saying, oh, we need to have wildlife. We don't have money for that.
Well, and interestingly, I just would like to know, on a positive, silver lining to the story, is there's been a lot of resistance historically to a prioritization, and being, well, once it's a priority, there's an expectation it's going to get done, right? And it's like, that was a little scary. However, I believe we are very, very close to a statewide prioritization process, so that may change to me.
And one of the things I did was, Pat, Julie, and I had a dog and pony show where we did the prioritization pitch, right? We talked about it, we had a PowerPoint presentation. I gave that thing so many times because when we did our last planning process, I gave it to every county. I had 15 counties and 2 cards. I gave it 17 times in a month. Talking about that, prioritization, how important it is for Southwest Colorado. And when Pat factored in the value of the loss of wildlife and the impact the state's economy, that really started kind of raising people back. They were like, oh wow, this really is a big deal. And then having the county commissioners present that back to Scott as an important issue for that.
Thank you, Pat. We're going to see if there are more questions. Okay, Tony was giving that presentation.
As transformer New York State DOT retired QIB, that question in every state so that we know New York, again, it's the message. But one of the things that I'm interested in, it's easy to put a value on milk, but on a doctor, it's the cost benefit analysis. 1,000 elk would just do the study, gives you a lot of numbers. I know what costs me on there's a value. The doctor, or landing store, look at the cost of value. Any insight on cost benefit analysis you can share with us, that what you learned and maybe what you're doing? So I think that's a huge.
We'll start.
So we don't value that from a financial standpoint, but we do as a practice, and we do a project. We have committed to doing a small mammal crossing every 500,000. So if we're putting in an underpass and overpass, no matter the length of the project, we're going to install it. It's just written into kind of our stewardship that and then just we have the transfer crossing. Did you guys go to the presentation? It's incredible, and everyone loves it, right? It's this kind of unique thing in Colorado. We have it where I'm at in Durango. They have a good time over here to trade that above. Everyone loves to come down and look at the transfers and talk about the transfers and volunteer time. And you build kind of local support and coalitions. And last legislative session, we talked about like 3 or 4 different topics. And that's how you get funding and stuff. We don't value, we don't put financial value on it because there's no impact if you're running over a car. But there's an emotional value in your constituents, so they force DOTs to consider those things.
Any of those turtles you mentioned, are they protected?
So that's the other driver. I talked about this in my presentation. It's policy driven for most of the stuff. Section 7, raccoons, fox, that has a value, but it oftentimes, unless it's sort of a local change or this alliance, it doesn't get pushed. And so, yes, like the tarantulas, you've got a local support that's pushing that, right? And that's a value that's communicated to the legislatures.
We're trying to, like Tony said, get the word out a little bit better on all our wildlife overpasses and underpasses with small crossings as well. And what we do is we put cameras in the small crossings. And then if you release that video and you get people emotionally attached, it can help your cause. Yeah.
We've done that too in New York State.
It didn't work?
No, it works. But
Yeah.
again, the public is very, it's like it kind of goes away pretty quick, but you still got to sell what she's talking about with people, the engineers, like, we don't like fix colors. Though you want to put in a wider shelf for wildlife conservation, even though we know that's 5% of the cost, you'll get pushback that, hey, we don't have time to do that.
Yeah.
Well, Minnesota's been doing it for 25 to 30 years, it's a standard bridge practice. That's our biggest benefit of it, any work, is our existing bridge structures and making them wider and making them wildlife friendly.
Yeah.
But you can't always sell it. But if you can put a number on it, and it's not easy to put a number on it, but we have the value of the Aran part of the moose, and the tourism is huge. When you put, how do you put a number on it? That's one, always interesting. So I just curious.
Agreed.
So.
Almost like a social value. I know Chuck and I were talking earlier about 22 and how they really, California really just like use that as a symbol, right? And like understanding your audience, like how to really utilize your captive audience to make it a big deal. So yeah, Pat, did you have more to add before we have maybe time for one more question?
So it's more for in line with the benefit cost analysis. And, early on, when I first started working on this stuff, and I go to traffic and safety, and they pulled out your formula to calculate your benefit cost ratio. And I started asking questions there. Can you improve wildlife value and some other things that, like, oh, we can, but, a little more convoluted process. But most traffic and safety agencies, especially in rural states, they don't account for the value of wildlife. They don't account for the physical value of the structure. So when you do a benefit cost analysis, it's only for a 30-year time. Yet you're designing some of these structures that have a 75-year life. But once you can grab that residual value beyond that 30-year BCA time frame and bring it back into the formula and account for it, the benefit cost ratio goes up. And it gets to the point where you can get grant. And so that was really where the eye opener came, is understanding that state DOTs are typically using value fatality and injury accidents and property damage based on, both NP, the National Transportation Safety Board numbers, as well as Attardo. Whereas the federal formula, when they're looking at the benefit cost ratios, the safety end of it, they're looking at actual costs that society incurs based on accidents. The federal formula looks at it completely different, where they're looking at what is society willing to pay to avoid that accident in the first place. So the valuation of the fatality and the injury accidents are probably 10 times higher than what the state traffic and safety goes. So really understanding some of that, I think what we did with CDOT helping them was we actually did a hybrid formula so they could look at their different priority areas. We used the state traffic and safety formula, but then we also integrated the value of wildlife and residual value in some of the larger structures. And that really allowed them to talk with their district administrators about apples to apples and some of these high priority areas and using state money. And so it's kudos to these guys that are learning this and understanding it and then taking it to the decision makers and helping them understand as well.
Okay, we are at the top of the hour. We just pulled out the two QR codes. So the first one on the top there is the prioritization study. So if you scroll down, it's actually a free resource page on the Alliance website. If you scroll down to data and information sharing, you'll see a link to the prioritization studies. There's a lot of other information up there as well. And then this prioritization one, we've got a clean handout on that for everyone, but feel free to take one. And just a really huge thank you. We'll stick around for the next few minutes. If you have questions, feel free to come up and ask. Get stickers, plenty of stickers. So if you have one sticker, pick grab one. There's also more out on some of the table sponsorship tables. And just a huge thank you for being here and